It's time for another podcast episode, and this time for something slightly different. As you know, our research here at UCD Jean Monnet Centre for the New Political Economy of Europe is oriented towards three key themes. The first is economic governance. The second is democratic legitimacy, and the third is protest and politics across the European Union. So far, in this podcast, we have talked a lot about political economy, but today's episode centers on a subject that is equally important and has drawn increasing attention over the course of the last few years. I'm referring, of course, to the rise of the far right across the European Union and the often uncomfortable questions that it poses. Does it make sense to call them populist, as many scholars and journalists do, or is this just a way of presenting the extreme right in a flattering light? Does the far-right mobilize voters who feel economic anxiety, cultural grievances, or both? And more importantly, are these two issues, culture and economics, separate spheres? Does it make sense to analyze them separately? For example, consider that a leading message of the far-right everywhere, pretty much, is immigrants are taking your jobs. Is this an economic or a cultural message? And do these parties need to defend the welfare state, even if in a chauvinistic way, in order to expand their electorate beyond the traditionally small constituency of the far right? Joining us to answer these questions is Daphne Halikiopoulou. Daphne is a professor of comparative politics at the University of Reading, who has been extensively researching nationalism and the far right. She has published a book on the extreme right in Greece titled The Golden Dawes Nationalist Solution, Reform and Transition in the Mediterranean. Daphne is also a prolific commentator, having appeared in BBC, Channel 4, France 24, and Bloomberg, among other media outlets. She is also the first speaker in our Centre Seminar series, which we have inaugurated this semester and you can check in our website. Our events are open to the public and you should feel free to drop by if you happen to be in Dublin at the time. That's all for now, and I'll leave you with the interview. Enjoy!
Okay, Daphne, thanks for coming along to University College Dublin, and your presentation today was really interesting. We might start off by talking about populism and the problem with the concept of populism, because you have written about this in the past. You might elaborate on whether or not populism as a concept has become stretched.
Absolutely, thank you. Just want to say thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to meet you and great to be part of this series. So yeah, you're spot on. The most important question is how useful is the term populism. I am becoming increasingly skeptical of the use of the term. I think it's used as basically a term to describe a type of politics or an ideology or even a political style, a rhetorical style that pits the pure people against the corrupt elite. I guess my problem with the term populism is that it can often be tautological. There is really no counterfactual to it, right? So at a stretch, any party, any leader, any individual speaks somehow about the people in a democracy. So we will find that across the party system, many parties use this type of narrative to distinguish, to somehow pit the people against the elite, etc., etc. So I wonder if it's a useful term at all. I also think there is a normative dimension to populism as well. So by calling parties populist, we basically say they're more legitimate, it's okay, there is some kind of element of democratic corrective to them, whereas I'm very skeptical that there is anything good about the rise of such parties. I don't think they're a democratic corrective. I think that if we're talking about the far right, we should call it the far right.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the far right for sure now in a moment, but just on the question of populism, it seems to me that there's a performative dimension to it as well. Who wouldn't want to be identified as a populist if going forth to the election? Is there something to be said, therefore, that the use of the term populism is almost a mobilizing force increasingly for what are now being called populist parties as opposed to being called far-right nationalist parties?
Absolutely. Far-right nationalist parties is a negative connotation, whereas a populist party is we the people. We stand for the people. We aim to attract and mobilize the people, often the discontent people who have had something wrong done to them by a corrupt elite or anyone. So yeah, I think that it normalizes the discourse of parties. Also, it equates different parties, making them all appear similar, whereas actually they're not. And this is not just a normative question, it's also an analytical question. We need to be able to categorize parties properly in order to understand why people are voting for them. So I think on both an analytical and a normative perspective, populism is a misleading term.
So you use the word far-right nationalism. That's the concept that unites your research. Is there something unique about the movements, far-right nationalist movements, parties that are emerging today, or have they been around for a long time?
I think that it's an oversimplification to call this phenomenon new. So you heard a lot of my research, and you saw that I've emphasized a lot the different waves in which electoral support for these parties comes and goes. If we look 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, a lot of these parties still had quite a lot of electoral support. The Front National made it to the second round of the presidential election previously. 2017 wasn't the first time. The FPO was in a coalition government in the late 1990s. Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands was successful in the early 2000s. So this phenomenon I don't think is new. However, and I'm sure you're going to want to pick up on this point, I think what is new is that by precisely what we said earlier, the populist narrative, the sort of attempt to blur the line between mainstream and far, what is new is that these parties are now permeating mainstream ground more. They're not marginalized anymore in the political system.
And in your research, you're quite critical of simplified cultural explanations for the rise of far-right nationalist parties. The standard explanation is, well, this is a cultural backlash. The losers of globalization want to have a particular identity. That identity is challenged. These parties come along, mobilize it, and it's really much about anti-immigration, nativism. Your research suggests that actually the story is far more complicated because there are real economic material underpinnings to this shift in what we're seeing at the moment.
Absolutely, you summarized it beautifully yourself. I think that the cultural argument does not reflect solely what is going on. I think the story is a far more complex story. I think that on the demand side, there are multiple insecurities that drive voters. Some of these have to do with culture. There are indeed certain voters that are, that believe that their culture has been eroded by immigrants or outsiders. But there is also an economic story there. There are a lot of voters who are economically insecure. This does not solely refer to the worse off, to the unemployed. It also refers to those who are relatively deprived, right? So an economic story is not just about unemployment. It's about all insecure groups who feel that they're worse off than they were in the past, who feel that they might be experiencing new risks, who feel that they might be in precarious position in the future. There is also an institutional story there about people who are protesting against what they believe is a state that is unable to deliver on its social contract obligation. So I don't think culture is the only answer.
I think it's quite useful to focus in on particular policy areas as you do, because one of the most interesting findings I think from your research is, if I can put it very simply, countries that have more generous unemployment benefits, arguably the defining feature of social protection and the welfare state, tend to mitigate against popular support for the far right.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a series of articles that I've published with my colleague Tim Vlanders from the University of Oxford. And what our starting point was to say, well, if economic insecurity does play a role, then let's see what happens if that insecurity is somehow mediated, right? If the risks and costs are lowered. And so we looked at a range of welfare state policies, both at the aggregate and at the individual level, a range of social groups in risk. So the unemployed, we looked at pensioners, we looked at particular types of workers, and we did find that welfare state policies tend to mediate far-right party support. So in other words, when they are more generous, then the people in the particular risky situation are less likely to vote for the far right. Of course, this is not an undisputable rule, and it doesn't function the same way in different countries, but we do find that social protection and compensation matters for support for these parties.
And it's complementary to the research that would suggest that austerity has effects, and austerity is an underpinning to what has given rise to far-right nationalist parties in some European countries, particularly, say, in England, which we might come to in a moment. But if it's the case that the welfare state mitigates against the rise of the far-right, what explains the popular support for the far right in Scandinavian countries then?
Exactly, and this is one criticism that we do tend to get. I would pose two answers here. So the first would be that, okay, so different countries function differently, and it is important to then look at distinct social groups within that country. Right, so especially in countries such as Scandinavia, where people are proud of their welfare state and they are proud of how well their institutions are functioning, then people, it's not strange, it's not odd to see that people would want to support that welfare state, and therefore they would want to keep immigrants out. So if we distinguish between social groups, and this is different research that I have done, and look at trust in institutions, good governance, etc., we see that actually in most European countries, in fact, those who are skeptical of immigration tend to become even more likely to vote for the far right when governance is good, when trust in institutions is higher. And this is precisely because they fear that if we then let immigrants in, this will erode the well-functioning institutions. Whereas it has a very different effect on those who are agnostic or those who are in favor of immigration. Then good governance is like, it makes them less likely to vote for the far right, but poor governance makes them more likely. So I think the answer to your question is, number one, it's important to look at different social groups. Not all people vote for the far right for the same reason. Societies consists of different social groups with different preferences. And then number two, it's also important to look at welfare states themselves and how inclusive they are. So the welfare state, how does it incorporate immigrants? What provisions does it have for outsiders?
If economic insecurity is a condition, relative economic insecurity, let's say, is an important condition for the rise of far-right nationalist parties, is it the case, therefore, that the far right have a core constituency? And that core constituency, quite frankly, are those who are racist and have very strongly held nativist, anti-immigrant views, who are unlikely to be swayed in any particular direction and will vote for that party that gives them a story about anti-immigration. Let's say that's 10% of the electorate. But actually, to reach out further than that 10% and to be in a position to challenge government or to mobilize the electorate, to be in a position to form coalition government, you have to reach out further. And the only way to reach out further is to focus in on those economic arguments, which are much more malleable to what the electorate think and feel.
Again, you summarized our argument beautifully. So that's precisely what we would argue. We would say that we, as in Tim Blandis and I in our articles, we basically make the distinction between what we call the culturalists and who we call the materialists. So the culturalists are those voters who are quite anti-immigrant, and they have primarily cultural concerns. You call them racist. They are those who emphasize the erosion of their national culture, culturalists. They tend to vote far right anyway, and this is why it becomes really important to make this distinction I said earlier between different social groups. They are the social group that is more likely to vote for the far right in any case, but they are not numerically that many. So a political party, in order to gain votes, in order to become even more prominent, more important, it needs to extend what we call its secure voting base. And in order to do that, it must somehow reach out to who we call the materialists. These are people with material concerns. They're not a necessary constituency for the far right, but they're numerically a much larger group. And if a party gets votes from them, then it's likely to extend. And this is why, let me jump onto the supply side, this is why a lot of far-right parties these days actually adopt a welfare state, strong welfare state position, precisely to cater for those voters who could otherwise go somewhere else. But if they gain votes from them, they will expand their voting base.
Yeah, I think this is very complementary to a kind of political economy analysis, political economy story, because I think, just to be clear as well, people often think when we talk about economic insecurity, we're talking about very poor people who are unemployed. That's not necessarily what's meant by economically insecure. It might well be somebody who has a relatively high income job, or who may not have college education, but feels, relatively speaking, that their material standard of living is not as high as it ought to be or could be. And they're also looking at their kids and they're seeing circumstances are changing, which I think fits with what we know about the story of economic inequality. that economic inequality has a very different effect depending on which social group we're talking about, and that kind of stagnant 50%, if you like, that maybe in absolute terms better off than a lot of other people in other parts of the world still relatively feel like things aren't great, and that's fertile ground for the far right. And it seems to me that Trump is an interesting part of the story here because, well, one could argue that Republicans vote Republican. They're going to vote Trump. But how then did he win Ohio? How did he win Michigan? How did he win Pennsylvania? These particular states. And it seems to me that it was an economic strategy that effectively mobilized those particular voters.
Yes, actually, I think that's a very good point. The US case makes a very good point precisely because it is the Republicans are one of the two main American political parties, US political parties. So obviously, Republican voters could potentially vote for Trump regardless. They would vote Republican because they are Republican. But to see, what makes that difference, what makes the party win, is their ability to go beyond this I would vote Republican anyway. And perhaps that has something to do with exactly what you say, the ability to catch the materialist voters, those discontent economically. And these are not, sorry, as you said again, these are not necessarily the worse off, not at all. This is anyone who feels some sort of insecurity worse off than they were vis-a-vis their neighbor, vis-a-vis someone else, So it's a broad group of people. It's not just the unemployed or the absolutely worse off.
And is it the case that far-right nationalist parties are very favourable towards the expansion of the welfare state and social protection, or is that just a particular grouping of far-right nationalist parties? Because some far-right nationalist parties would be classically neoliberal, free market, get rid of the state.
I think some of them are. I would argue that this is an increasing trend. So we used to have, the classic Kitchell's winning formula. So parties, far-right parties, more neoliberal economically and conservative socially. But increasingly, and there is a lot of literature on that, so we're definitely not, the only ones saying it. On the contrary, there's a lot of political economy literature at the moment showing that increasingly these parties are adopting a strong welfare position, I think precisely because they know that capturing these voters is the key to electoral success. From a little research that we have done on this, I can tell you that parties such as the Front National have very obviously done this. Also the FPO to an extent, but it's true that not all of them do. There is variation.
So on the supply side, as you've just said, these parties are clever. They're obviously looking at the electorate. They need to generate a discourse and they need to legitimate their strategies vis-a-vis the electorate. Your research suggests that one of the distinguishing characteristics of new far-right nationalist parties is that they have become more civic nationalist in the sense of they're not explicitly exclusive in terms of who's in the out-group or the in-group per se. Perhaps you could elaborate on that for our listeners.
Yes, again, this sort of came from some work I did with Sofia Vassilopoulou from the University of York, when we basically made this empirical observation that the parties that are winning, those who seem to be more successful, are those that are putting forward a bit of a different nationalist narrative, right? So traditionally we expect the extreme right, if you like, to be parties that are focusing on excluding on the basis of ascriptive criteria. So we expect them to be, you said it earlier yourself, racist, blatantly racist. But increasingly, if we listen to these parties, this is not the case. They especially, even some of them, well, they reject the racist label altogether. But they go as far as say that, we are not racist because we do not exclude people on the basis of their race or color or creed. But what they do is that they employ a narrative of values. And they play with the boundaries of toleration. So they say we exclude those who are intolerant of our liberal democratic values. And we thought, okay, this is really interesting because essentially what they're doing is that they're kind of walking into civic nationalist territory here. Instead of drawing on something that someone is born with, they're drawing on something that is not fixed. They're drawing on institutional and value-based features. So regardless of what religion you're born in, if you espouse, our secularity, our liberal democracy, you're allowed to be part of our in-group. And I think this is a really important development, because this makes these parties not only appear more legitimate, but also much more difficult to combat.
And also, it's fairly legitimate to say, well, we have particular liberal values, and therefore to be perceived as the defender of those liberal values is, I think, something that's rather new, because that's not typically how we would have thought about far-right nationalist parties. And I think societies probably have a big challenge on their hand if it is the case that far-right nationalist parties have become the champion of those things that we all take for granted, which are secular values.
Absolutely. And this is precisely why they are now entering mainstream territory. So it's becoming increasingly blurred and difficult to distinguish between what is far and what is mainstream. And is it really then, are they far right and they're adopting this? Or could we say that they're no longer far right and that's why they're adopting this? I think it makes it very, very difficult to counter, but also makes it very difficult to convince that they are not extreme.
And it's interesting because the posters that you put up in your presentation today from the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD in Germany, one of which was two ladies in a bikini saying, we wear bikinis, not burqas. One was a picture of a pig, we eat pork. And that's kind of interesting because in my mind, the AfD are an old conservative group of men who are skeptical about the euro, skeptical about Southern Europe, have very fiscally conservative views. But just looking at those posters, they've seemed to have re-imaged themselves a bit more like the Dutch far right, which is basically liberal parties.
Yes, I would say exactly that. I mean, all the arguments are value arguments, not race arguments. And a lot of European parties, another case, what struck me when we were writing this article that I'm telling about the civic zeitgeist, a few years ago, we were looking into the SVP manifesto, and in it was written in English, and interestingly, it started with a misquotation of Karl Popper about the boundaries of toleration. And it asked, would you tolerate those who, if they were in our position, would not tolerate us? And this is exactly what these parties are doing. They're targeting any outsider, not because they are born an outsider, but precisely because they appear intolerant. And this way they link it to terrorism, which is another really interesting development, and they make this outsider or this outgroup appear really threatening in terms of values.
And it's complementary to the material economic based argument, because it seems to me that a core characteristic of far-right nationalist parties and those who tend to support them is this idea that, well, we pay our taxes, we work, and they don't. So and again, that's a very convincing argument for a lot of working class people who work extremely hard and feel that their taxes and their work is not being rewarded, whereas the guy down the road is not working and he is.
Well, exactly. So these parties at the supply side, they have this dual argument, right? On the one hand, they emphasize values, and on the other hand, they emphasize welfare. Now, this means that immediately the outsider is presented as threatening, as potentially intolerant, and a scrounger of our well-functioning welfare state. And through this narrative, these parties are able to cater to the different social groups. So if you're a culturalist, the value argument is great for you. If you're concerned about welfare provision, the welfare argument is really caters for you. And so I think that this allows them, it makes them really appealing to broad sectors of the population. They're capitalizing on the multiple insecurities, not just one, but the multiple insecurities that drive different voting groups.
And I think it's probably fair to say that the parties that will struggle the most in response to this are parties of the left.
You're absolutely right. And this is, I think, what I said in the beginning, the key issue, the key challenge that these parties face. The key challenge that these parties pose, the far-right parties pose, is that they now drive party competition. The ball is in their court, in other words. And so other parties think that in order to address them, we need to imitate them, right? To combat the far right, you need to become the far right. And I think this is the greatest problem. Now, the far left, or the left generally, is the competitor if you see these parties as gaining protest votes, right? So the disillusioned mainstream voter is really disillusioned because they perceive, I don't know, that the state is not functioning properly, or that they didn't get what they had voted for in the past. So they either go left or right. but they're going right, and that's the question, what can the left do? I think the problem with the left is that there is a bit of an identity crisis, right? And it's a bit of a catch-22. What do you do? Do you go left nationalist, which could be potentially electorally successful and could catch voters, but in a way it's also going nationalist, so it might be against your core ideology? Or do you stay mainstream, and that means that you may be more true to your values, but you don't catch as many voters? It is an important question, I think.
Is there something distinctive about the left civic nationalism of parties, let's say like Sinn Féin in Ireland, or the Scottish Nationalist Party in Scotland, or in Catalonia? Is that something that's qualitatively different?
So again, as we were talking about earlier, I think so. I have argued in the past that the left is civic, and I think that that's a classic argument that's made generally. The left, when the left is nationalist, it puts forward a civic nationalism. But then, as I've also argued today, and you saw from my work, I also argue that the right, the far right, can be civic. So we need to unfold this a little bit. If they're both civic, does that mean they're the same? No. I think we need to nuance the category of civic. I think there are different subcategories of civic, or institutional, or politico-institutional nationalism, if you like. So there is a difference between left nationalism and right nationalism. And within this nationalism, I think within the left nationalism, there is also a difference, I think, between the nationalism that is pro-EU. So look at some of the, nationalist parties of, within the UK, sort of the SNP, etc. These are pro-EU parties. I think they are nationalism and inclusive civic. Is that a category? And I think that is the reason for that is that because their nationalism is directed primarily against, the Britain, and so they see the EU as furthering their nationalist interests. Where there is a nationalism of the left that is also very Eurosceptic, and that is a nationalism of the core, if you like.
Does English nationalism explain the politics of Brexit? And I don't just mean the determining factors behind who voted for Remain or Leave. I mean the entire politics of what's happening at the moment. It has become so salient. The Tory party have effectively internalised the narrative of what UKIP, Brexit party. And it just seems to me, from the outside, looking in, I think for a lot of people, that something is happening within England in particular. And it's very much a powerful nationalist story.
So I would answer this the same way I have answered with my demand-supply framework. On the demand side, I think that multiple insecurities drove Brexit, and different people voted for Brexit for different reasons. Some did so because there was a nationalism to the way that they were thinking, right? They don't want to be part of Europe. Others did it because they're economically insecure and they were the left behind who, fear that the EU is something that basically whatever is against their economic interests. Others again did it because of protest. They thought, okay, I'm discontent with whatever, I will vote against the EU as a scapegoat. There are multiple insecurities. But I think you're right that at the supply side level, the fact that this vote happened in the first place, and that it was driven in a way by very much, I think, an English nationalism agenda.
Yeah, it just seems that many commentators, media outlets, political parties, the Tory, have just so quickly internalized this narrative, and things seem to have changed very fast. Maybe there was a very deep, latent underlying nationalism, of course, with UKIP and so forth, but it just seems to me that this has become more mainstream, and I wonder if it's because the Tory party themselves have effectively become a sovereignist nationalist party.
But yeah, blurring again the lines between, what is extreme and what is mainstream. If you think about, 52 versus 48% is not a massive result at all. Some people voted for it, small majority, but the narrative of how this, this has been put through, I think is very much a party dynamic question more than it is a demand side question.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for coming to UCD, and hopefully, and no doubt, we will be reading and hearing about your research in the near to medium long-term future. Thank you.
Thank you.